To celebrate my graduation, I decided to take a holiday up to the Highlands of Scotland. I had a minivan, and getting out of the city for a couple of weeks was just too tempting, so I filled her up, and off I went. It was as beautiful as I'd hoped. Within a few hours I was among mountains, glens, lochs, and evergreen forests. As night came, I happened by an old pub in the middle of nowhere. The town itself was a single street, just a few old grey brick houses. I wondered what the people who lived there did for work because the nearest big town was at least an hour's drive away. I parked up and went inside. It was an old-fashioned place, and the barman was dressed in an old-fashioned style himself. So were the couple of old fellas that were sitting around the fire. I imagined they were quite traditional up here, and I hoped they spoke English and not just Gaelic. Thankfully, they did. I stood and chatted with the barman for a while. He asked me what I was doing, so I told him I'd just finished university and was up here to get a bit of space. "You'll find plenty of that up here," he said, and refilled my glass. It was an old bottle of some Highland Scotch. I didn't recognise the brand, but it was smooth and mellow and really hit the spot. I asked him how he kept afloat with so few people around, and he looked at me with a wry smile and said something like, "Oh, you know, we get the odd tourist," and chuckled, filling up my glass again. I had a bit of a buzz on when I said goodnight to my new friends, but I knew when it was time to get my head down in the camper van, and I slept a very peaceful sleep. It was almost silent outside but for a gentle breeze. I got up in the morning and after a quick cup of tea on the stove, set off. I'd already asked about breakfast and the barman had told me that they wouldn't be open in the morning. Another couple of hours of glorious scenery, and I made my next stop, for breakfast, in the next town over. I was glad to see their pub was open, and there were a couple of other camper vans and people sitting outside enjoying fried breakfasts. I decided to sit outside too. When the waitress brought me back my sausage, bacon, egg and black pudding, I joked that the place was a bit livelier than the place down the road, and she looked a little bit puzzled. "You know," I said, "the old town, with the old pub in it back that way," and gestured in the general direction of it, and she laughed. She didn't go down that way much, she said. She thought it was creepy. 2 weeks later, and I was ready for civilization again, heading back down towards the city. I stopped off at the lovely breakfast pub at tea time, and had a wonderful steak and ale pie with chips, then decided to make the drive back to see the old boys, and get myself a couple of those lovely whiskies again, sleep in the camper van overnight one last time, before I went back to normality. As I pulled into the old town, off the main road, I noticed something I hadn't before. The row of houses were derelict. The windows were all boarded up and broken. The roofs were sagging in. It was obvious that nobody lived there. They couldn't have. I got to the end of the street, to the pub, and I couldn't understand what I saw. The pub was derelict too, and judging by the tree that was growing up from the inside and out through the roof, it had been for decades. It was getting dark, and I started to shiver, but I decided not to wait and see if that pub was going to open again. In fact, I put my foot down, and I didn't stop driving until I was outside my house, back in the city, a few hours later. While I was stationed in Iraq, our company had settled into a small village with orders just to sit and wait for instructions and babysit the locals for a while. They seemed happy to have us there for the protection we offered against bandits and raiders, and they used to bring us little gifts sometimes, maybe some extra food if they had any, cigarettes and things like that. We could see for miles around, so it was a pretty easy job. Nobody was sneaking up on us, that was for sure. The town itself had 2 cemeteries, both filled with Arabic-inscribed headstones, but one seemed newer than the other. The older one had a crumbling stone wall around it, and an iron gate that was chained shut. It seemed odd to chain it shut when you could have easily climbed over the walls. They were only up to my hip, and I'm an average 5'11". The newer one didn't have any walls at all. Stranger still was why there were 2 cemeteries anyway. The town was tiny with a tiny population. I guess there must have only been 100 people living there. Why did they need 2 cemeteries? In the 2 months we'd been stationed there, we hadn't even seen a single funeral. One night, we'd managed to smuggle in some booze off the black market. One of the locals we trusted managed to sort it out for us. There wasn't much, a couple of bottles of vodka and 12 beers between us, but enough for us to get a buzz on after literally months dry. A little while later, one of our boys, Hackett, was goofing off, and he's walking around on the wall of that older looking cemetery. Our friend, the one who'd gotten us the booze, saw him and immediately started shouting in Arabic and waving at him to get down. He was madder than I'd ever seen him. Melonon, he kept saying. I didn't know what he meant, but then he remembered the English and started shouting, "Curse! Curse!" Hackett just laughed and shouted, "Oh yeah, curse this!" And he started pissing off the side of the wall into the graveyard, and everyone thought it was hilarious, including me. Our friend upped and left our party by the fire, slamming the door to his little house. Throughout the night, there was this strange noise. We hadn't heard anything like it before. It reminded me of an animal. It was eerie as hell. It seemed to come from all around the plains in the darkness. It almost sounded like a voice. One of the boys said it was just the wind, and we all agreed, but there wasn't any wind, and we all knew it. The next morning we got radioed to go and check out something a few clicks away. There was another village and there had been reports of Taliban soldiers doing the rounds, and we were to get a head start on them before they found us. We tied our boots and, locked and loaded, we set off out of the village just after first light with Hackett on point. We walked for 2 minutes, when there was a bang, a flash and a puff of smoke, and Hackett disappeared. The ground around where he had been stood was blackened, and when I looked around, I saw what was left of his body, minus his legs, some feet away. It was a largely civilian area, so there were no minefields. We all decided that it could only have been an unexploded shell, but how it had sat there for so long on the main road of the village, without going off, God only knew. Our friend the local didn't speak to us again after that. The Taliban activity turned out to be a goose chase, and shortly after, we were ordered out of the village. I couldn't tell you for sure whether or not my old house on Kilmorey Gardens was haunted. Of course I saw things from time to time, and my mother claimed to as well. Were they ghosts? I don't know. I remember some of the things very vividly, but memory can be unreliable, and it was such a long time ago. It certainly wasn't an old house, steeped in draconian mysteries or long dark shadows. It was a very modest but relatively new build, on what the townsfolk called the electric scheme. It had been one of the first to have electric streetlights, long before I was born, but the name had stuck. I think people still call it that to this day. It was small, too. There wasn't much room for me and my mother, let alone any unwanted guests from the other side. There were 2 floors, but it was an oddly narrow house. The rooms were tiny. There were occasions in that house when unexplainable things happened. We had several cats over the years, but none stayed. They would all have these strange outbursts of hostility, not towards us, but sometimes to an object like a cup or a book, or sometimes an empty space in a room. They would hiss and growl as if they were warning off another cat from straying into their territory. Neither my mother nor myself dared go near them in that state. They were wild and terrifying. When whichever cat had finished its weird, angry little tirade at seemingly nothing, they would go back to purring and grooming themselves as if nothing had happened. My mother would be too freaked out to keep it by that point. So off went Judy, Gizmo, Mayo and Chuffs to new homes, and without much upset. They were never part of the family for long enough for us to get very attached. We had no shower unit. Our bathroom upstairs was literally that, a room with a toilet, a sink, and a metal bath that sat on 4 legs and one of those things that you stick on both the hot and cold taps that has a shower nozzle attached to it. They were always made of thick rubber, so it was impossible to tell if the water was scalding hot or freezing until it hit you in the face. Either way, there were a lot of yelps. My mother used to let me mess around with it for a bit before it was time for her to wash my hair. I used to blast the mounds of floating bubble bath foam as if I was Triton or Neptune, wrathfully melting icebergs in my tiny ocean. Eventually I would get bored and turn it on myself and let the water wash over my face until my mother came back in. I'd shouted to tell her that I was ready. I'd gotten so bored that night that I'd actually lathered up the shampoo in my hair myself, and badly. The foam had run down over my eyes, so I knew that if I were to open them, they would face certain stinging doom. The shower thing was pumping hot water into the bath near my toes, and it felt good, so I just waited. Shortly, I heard the door creak, and in a moment, her hands were on my scalp and in my hair, scrubbing gently. I used to love that part. I don't think anything in my adult life has ever relaxed me as much as my mum washing my hair for me. I heard the phone start to ring, and that put an end to my short moment of bliss. We had a landline phone. It wasn't so old-fashioned that it had a rotary dial, but mobile phones weren't common at all when I was growing up. Auntie Val used to call us every Sunday night, which, coincidentally, was always bath night too. I don't know if she'd rang early that night, or I'd had my bath late, but either way my lovely relaxing hair wash was about to come to an abrupt halt. The phone was downstairs. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and my mother just kept scrubbing my head. It wasn't like her to ignore the phone. Then the ringing stopped and I heard a muffled voice. I could tell it was my mother's. She shouted up the stairs to me that my Auntie Val was on the phone and that she'd be up in 5 minutes. The fingers that were embedded in the curls of my hair tightened a little, stretching the skin of my scalp. And that is when I started to scream. The next few minutes were a bit of a blur, but my mother raced up to the bathroom when she heard me, and soon enough I was wrapped up in her arms, drying off by the fire. I remember eating some sort of pudding that night. I think it was maybe butterscotch. I don't remember her being angry with me, but I have a feeling she didn't take what had happened very seriously. In spite of her telling me occasionally she'd seen odd things herself, she often put my experiences down to me watching too many horror movies, which was her fault, of course, because she let me watch them. We talked about it years later after I'd become an adult. She didn't remember the flavour of the pudding either, but she remembered a few other, more important things. She remembered hearing my screams and running up the stairs. She remembered Auntie Val racing round to the house and banging on the front door to find out what the hell had been going on, because she'd heard my screaming over the phone. It was a funny old thing though, she'd told me. She couldn't work out why I'd gotten out of the bath before chaos erupted. I told her that I hadn't. I'd been in the bath the whole time, waiting for her. But I must have, she told me, because when she got to the top of the stairs there were wet footprints all the way down the landing that led from the bathroom and stopped in front of the wall at the end of the house. She couldn't figure out how I'd managed to get back in the bath and leave only a single trail of footsteps going away from it. You must have walked backwards, she said. Now she came to think of it, there were quite big footprints for such a little boy.